The candle was still burning when Thomas Walker finally came through the door. Alberta Bailey stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room of the boarding house. She ran on the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, her arms crossed over her chest, her dark hair loose around her shoulders the way she never wore it during daylight hours. The candle on the windowsill had burned nearly to its base. Tallow wax had pooled and hardened in a pale ring around the tin holder. It was past midnight. She knew it was past midnight because the clock on the mantel had chimed the hour twice over while she had been sitting in the wooden chair, pretending she was not waiting. She was waiting. Thomas Walker stopped in the doorway, his hat in his hand, trailed dust on his coat, and something raw and deeply unsettled behind his gray eyes. He looked at the candle on the windowsill. He looked at her. He opened his mouth as if he might say something ordinary, something that would let them both pretend the evening had been entirely unremarkable. Instead, what he said was quiet and stripped of every pretense he usually wore like armor. "I have not had anyone wait up for me," he said. Alberta held his gaze. She did not move. She did not blow out the candle. She did not apologize for it sitting there in the window, burning itself down to nothing in the dark for his sake. The silence between them was not empty. It was the fullest silence Alberta Bailey had ever stood inside of, loaded with every secret Thomas Walker had spent the better part of 3 months keeping from her, and every feeling she had spent the same 3 months refusing to name. Outside, the Kansas night wind moved through the scrub grass and sent a loose shutter banging somewhere down the road. Inside, the candle flame swayed but did not go out. This was not the moment where their story began. But it was the moment where everything that had been building underneath the surface of ordinary days finally cracked open. To understand what it meant that Alberta Bailey had put a candle in the window for a man she claimed was nothing more than a long-term boarder, and to understand why Thomas Walker looked at that small, deliberate flame as though it were the most dangerous thing he had encountered since he rode into Caldwell 3 months prior, it was necessary to go back to the beginning. It was necessary to go back to the morning of September the 4th, 1878, when Alberta Bailey opened her front door with flour on her apron, and found a man she had never seen before standing on her porch with a horse that looked nearly as exhausted as he did. Caldwell, Kansas in the autumn of 1878 was a town in the process of becoming something. It sat near the Kansas Indian Territory border, a cattle trail town that drew cowboys and merchants and lawmen, and all the variety of men that a trail town collected like dust collects on a windowsill. Alberta had come to Caldwell 3 years earlier with her late husband, David Bailey, who had believed in the promise of the frontier with the kind of conviction that could not survive contact with the reality of it. David had died of fever in the summer of 1876, leaving Alberta at 27 years of age with a property, a small amount of debt, and a clear-eyed understanding that sentiment was a luxury she could not afford. She had turned the property into a boarding house. She ran it the way she ran everything else in her life, with precise attention and a firmness of purpose that the town of Caldwell had largely come to respect and occasionally to fear. She kept 4 rooms for boarders, cooked 2 meals a day, charged fair rates, and maintained a reputation for not tolerating trouble under her roof. She was not unfriendly. She was simply honest about the nature of the transaction, and she did not make the mistake of confusing business with personal feeling. She had been doing perfectly well on her own terms. Then Thomas Walker came to her door on the morning of September the 4th with that exhausted horse and dust in the creases of his face, and asked in a voice that was careful and measured, and gave away nothing at all whether she had a room available. He was perhaps 32 or 33, she thought. Tall, with the lean build of a man who had spent years outdoors, gray eyes that were attentive in a way that went beyond ordinary alertness, dark hair that wanted cutting. He wore a good quality coat that had seen hard use. He was not carrying anything that immediately suggested trouble, but Alberta Bailey had been running a boarding house in a cattle trail town for 2 years, and she had developed what she privately considered a reasonable ability to read the men who came to her door. Thomas Walker, she thought in that first moment, was a man with a hidden motive. She did not know yet what kind. She told him she had one room remaining. He paid the first 2 weeks in advance with coin that was genuine, which she tested with the practiced discretion of a woman who had been offered counterfeits before. She showed him the room. She told him the rules of her house, which included no gambling on the premises, no excessive drinking, and no hours past 10 o'clock that disturbed other boarders. She told him meals were at 6 in the morning and at 6 in the evening, and if he missed them, that was his own affair. He thanked her with the same careful courtesy he had shown at the door, and that was the beginning. For the first 2 weeks, Thomas Walker was exactly what he appeared to be. He kept his room clean. He was present for meals and ate without complaint, and was polite to the other boarders, which at that time included a cattle merchant named Gerald Voss who talked too much about prices, a young schoolteacher named Miss Frances Ellison who was new to Caldwell and still finding her footing, and an older gentleman named Mr. Percy Hatfield who was supposedly retired and spent most of his time reading newspapers on the porch. Thomas Walker was not a man who volunteered information about himself. Alberta noticed this because she had grown accustomed to boarders who filled silence with their own history, who wanted audience for their stories of where they came from and where they were going, and what they intended to accomplish when they got there. Thomas Walker did not tell her where he had come from, did not explain what had brought him to Caldwell specifically, and when the cattle merchant Gerald Voss pressed him at supper one evening in the cheerful, intrusive way that Gerald Voss pressed everyone, Thomas Walker deflected the questions with such smooth and unobtrusive courtesy that it took Voss several minutes to realize he had been deflected at all. Alberta noticed. She noticed because she was a careful woman, and because something about Thomas Walker's particular brand of quietness struck her as deliberate rather than merely reserved. There was a difference, she had learned over the years, between a man who did not talk because he had nothing to say and a man who did not talk because he had made a considered decision not to say it. Thomas Walker was the second kind. She did not press him. It was not her place within the terms of their arrangement to press him. But she watched, and she filed away what she observed, because Alberta Bailey did not like surprises and she had a boarding house to protect. What she observed in those first 2 weeks was a man who spent his mornings doing something she could not quite account for. He would leave after breakfast and return before supper, and he would not say where he had been. Twice she saw him speaking to the sheriff, a solid, capable man named Arthur Crail, who had the look of someone who already knew what was being discussed. Once she saw Thomas Walker standing at the edge of the cattle pens at the south end of town, watching the activity there with an attention that did not resemble that of a casual observer. She began to wonder, with increasing specificity, whether Thomas Walker was a lawman of some variety, a federal marshal or a detective of the sort that the Pinkerton agency sent into towns under cover of ordinary identities. It would explain the careful distances he maintained, the watchfulness, the deliberate erasure of personal history from every conversation. It would also explain, she thought, the worn-in quality of his attentiveness. That was the only word she had for it. He was attentive in the way that a man became attentive when his survival had, at some point in his past, depended on noticing things. It was not the attentiveness of a man who was nervous. It was the attentiveness of a man who was trained. She did not ask him about it. But on the evening of the 14th day after his arrival, when the other boarders had retired and she was washing the supper dishes, she heard him come into the kitchen doorway and stop. "Do you need any help with that?" he asked. It was such an ordinary question that she almost laughed. She did not. "I manage it every evening without assistance," she told him. "I expect you do," he said. There was no condescension in it. It sounded more like a genuine observation about her general capacity, and that was different enough from what men usually said when they observed her doing something alone that she glanced back at him over her shoulder. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms loose at his sides, not pressing just there. He looked tired in a way that she was beginning to think might be his baseline, a deep tiredness that was not about one night's sleep or even many nights' sleep, but about something longer and more complicated. "You are welcome to sit," she said, because it seemed unkind not to offer it when he looked like that. He sat at the kitchen table while she finished the dishes. He did not fill the silence with unnecessary talk. She found, to her private surprise, that the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the first time in a long while that she had been in a room with a man and not felt the need to manage the quality of the quiet, to smooth it over or direct it away from anything. That was the evening that started something, though she would not have named it that if pressed. The second month brought frost to the Kansas plains and the kind of wind that found the gaps in buildings. Alberta added wood to the stove and made heavier suppers, and the boarding house had its particular autumn feeling of everyone drawn a little closer to the warmth. The cattle merchant Gerald Voss finished his business and departed. His room was taken by a widow named Mrs. Henrietta Oakes, who was passing through on her way to join her daughter in Denver, and who stayed for 3 weeks because the weather closed the northern trails. Thomas Walker stayed. He paid each new week in advance, the same way, without discussion. Alberta stopped expecting him to leave any particular week because she realized she had no actual information about his timeline, and asking felt like overstepping the boundaries of their arrangement. She told herself this was sensible management of her boarding house. She told herself this specifically because she noticed she was not entirely neutral about whether he stayed or went, and she did not quite trust that noticing yet. He had begun, in the second month, to do small things around the property that she had not asked him to do. He repaired the loose step on the back porch. He split extra wood when he saw the pile was getting low and stacked it under the overhang before she had mentioned it. One morning she came out to find he had fixed the water pump handle, which had been requiring a particular awkward upward jerk to operate that she had simply adapted to without thinking much about whether it was actually functional. She thanked him for each of these things in the same practical tone she used for everything else, because she did not want to make something large of what were probably just the habits of a man who was accustomed to being useful. He accepted her thanks the same way, without elaboration. But one evening she caught him in the act of noticing the roof shingles above the east bedroom, standing back in the yard with his head tilted up and that assessing look on his face. And she came out to stand beside him and look up at what he was looking at, and he said, "You have 2 shingles that will not survive a hard winter rain," and she said, "I know," and he said, "I can fix them on Saturday," and she said, "You do not have to do that," and he said very quietly, "I know." He fixed them on Saturday. She made extra coffee and brought him a cup while he was on the roof, and set it on the top porch railing for when he came down, and he did come down and drink it, and they stood together on the porch for a few minutes looking at the gray October sky and saying nothing, and it was one of those moments that had the quality of something that mattered without either of them doing anything at all remarkable. The trouble started in the 3rd week of October. Alberta became aware of it gradually, the way trouble often arrived in a town like Caldwell, through the accumulation of small wrong notes rather than one obvious announcement. She noticed that Sheriff Crail was out later than usual 2 nights in a row. She noticed that 2 of the hands from the Harkin cattle operation, which ran through the southern corridor between Caldwell and the territory line, were sitting in the saloon at an unusual hour on a Tuesday, and watching the street with a focused quality she associated with men who were waiting for something specific. She noticed that Thomas Walker came back from wherever he went in the mornings looking more tightly wound than usual, his jaw set, his eyes doing more of that rapid cataloging of his surroundings. She noticed all of this, and she did not say anything directly because she still did not officially know what Thomas Walker was doing in Caldwell, and there was a part of her that was not sure she wanted the answer. The answer came anyway. On the 23rd of October, she came downstairs at 5 in the morning to start the kitchen fire and found Thomas Walker sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Not sleeping, sitting. With both hands flat on the tabletop, and his eyes open, and a stillness about him that was so concentrated it stopped her in the doorway. He heard her come in, of course, and turned his head, and there was a moment where she saw something in his face that he had not been expecting to show anyone, something that looked a great deal like the specific exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a secret for too long by himself. "I woke you," he said, though she had not indicated she was awake yet. "No," she said. "I always start the fire at 5. She came into the kitchen and started the fire without making any production of his presence. When the stove was going and she had put the kettle on, she sat down at the other end of the table and looked at him in the early half-light and said, 'You might as well tell me.' 'I will likely find out anyway. I always do.' He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, 'I'm a deputy marshal out of the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas. I have been in Caldwell on an assignment for the past 7 weeks. She absorbed this. "The Harkin operation," she said, because it was the only thing that had been accumulating enough wrong notes to warrant a federal presence. His expression shifted slightly, something that on a less controlled face would have been surprise. "Yes," he said. "Harkin has been running cattle that are not his across the territory line, which is a violation of the treaties with the Cherokee Nation, as well as straightforward theft. There are also allegations that some of the men who have disappeared in this region over the past year and a half met their end at the hands of men employed by Harkin." "Men have disappeared," Alberta said. She did not phrase it as a question. "3 that we know of, probably more." The kettle began to make its preliminary sounds. She got up and made coffee, and she brought him a cup and sat back down, and she said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you have been watching me for 7 weeks, he said. "You are not a woman who misses things, Mrs. Bailey, and I am getting close to the end of this assignment, and I cannot afford to have you accidentally involved. You need to know enough to stay away from certain things." It was such a practical reason. It was also, she thought, not the only reason. He could have told her less than he had and accomplished that practical purpose just as well. "How close?" she asked. "Another week, perhaps 2. We are waiting for a specific shipment to cross the line which will give us what we need." "And then you will leave," Alberta said. It was not a complaint. She intended it as a simple acknowledgement of the facts of the situation as she now understood them. But something in how she said it, or something in the plain accuracy of it, made Thomas Walker go quiet in a way that was different from his usual quietness. "Yes," he said after a moment. "That is generally what happens." She looked at him and he looked at her, and outside the Kansas dawn was beginning to color the horizon through the kitchen window, and Alberta Bailey thought with unusual clarity that she did not want this man to leave. This was the thing she had been refusing to name. She named it now, privately, sitting at her kitchen table with the first coffee of the morning going warm between her hands. She named it and she felt the weight of it, and she made no outward sign whatsoever, because Alberta Bailey had been managing her internal life with great discipline for quite some time. She said, "Then I will make sure the other boarders are not on the South Street on whichever day that is. I have some influence over the daily arrangements of this household." "I know you do," he said, and there was something in how he said it that made her think he was not only talking about the boarding house. The next 10 days were the most peculiar of Alberta's adult life, because they were days in which she continued to run her boarding house exactly as she always had, cooking meals and managing her boarders and maintaining her accounts, while beneath the surface of every ordinary hour ran the knowledge of what Thomas Walker was doing, and the knowledge of what she had admitted to herself about how she felt about it, and neither of these things could be discussed or changed or acted on. Thomas Walker was, during these same days, carefully and deliberately not doing anything different either. But there were small moments that accumulated in the way small moments do when two people are paying very close attention to each other. An evening when he helped her carry in the week's supplies from the wagon without being asked, and their hands happened to brush passing the flour sack, and neither of them said anything about it, but neither of them pretended it had not happened. A supper when Mrs. Oakes made a light-hearted comment about the lovely domesticity of it all, and Alberta caught the very brief private expression on Thomas Walker's face before he smoothed it back into courtesy. A morning when she was reading a newspaper on the front porch, and he came out and sat on the top step, and she told him what was in the paper, and he listened, and offered his thoughts, and they talked, really talked, about Kansas politics and the beef market, and the question of whether the territory ought to be organized. And she found that his mind was interesting, and that he had opinions he could defend with evidence, and that he was interested in her opinions in a way that was not merely polite. He was actually interested. She thought about these days often afterward. They were ordinary days, shaped by work and weather, and the small requirements of keeping a household running in a cattle trail town. They were also days she kept returning to the way the tongue returns to a sore tooth, not because they hurt, but because they mattered. On the 3rd of November, Thomas Walker did not come home for supper. Alberta served supper to her boarders, who at this point were Miss Ellison, Mr. Hatfield, and a new arrival named Mr. Carey, who was a land speculator from Missouri. She was composed and efficient, and answered Mr. Carey's questions about the land prices in the surrounding county with her usual informed precision. She cleared the table and washed the dishes. She listened to Mr. Hatfield read from his newspaper on the front porch for a while, contributing occasional observations, until he went in for the evening. She did not go to bed. She sat in the wooden chair in the front room, and she put a candle in the window. She told herself it was simply practical, a light for a boarder coming home late, as she would have done for any of them. She told herself this, and she sat in the dark room with the one lit window, and she waited, and she knew herself well enough to know that this was not actually about any other boarder. Outside, Caldwell was doing the things a cattle trail town did at night. There were sounds from the saloon 2 blocks east. There were horses moving on the main street. There was the wind, always the Kansas wind, working through every gap and hollow of the town. She did not know what was happening with the Harkin operation tonight. She did not know if Thomas Walker was safe. She had not been told this would be the night. She waited. She was still waiting when she heard, just after midnight by the mantel clock, footsteps on the porch that she recognized by their particular rhythm, the slightly longer reach of a tall man's stride, the deliberate quiet of boots trying not to wake a house that was asleep. Thomas Walker came through the door and stopped. He looked at the candle on the windowsill, nearly burned to its base. He looked at her sitting in the chair in the dark room with the candle making a small warm circle in the window. "I have not had anyone wait up for me," he said. Alberta held his gaze. She did not move. She did not apologize for the candle. The silence held everything. It was Thomas Walker who finally crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her. He moved carefully, and she could see now in the low light that his coat sleeve was torn, and there was a dark bruise already forming along his jaw, and the general appearance of a man who had had a very difficult several hours. He set his hat on the table between them. He sat back. He breathed. "Is it done?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Harkin and 3 of his men are in the sheriff's custody. The others ran for the territory, and Sheriff Crail has sent word to the marshal's service to pick them up on the other side. Are you hurt?" "Nothing that will not mend." He said this the way men said it when they wanted to close the subject of their own vulnerability. But he did not look away from her, and she thought that perhaps he was not trying quite as hard to close it as he usually would have. She stood and went to the kitchen and came back with the tin of salve she kept for household injuries and a clean cloth damp with water. She sat back down across from him and held these things out. He took them. He cleaned the cut on his jaw, which she could see better now, and he applied the salve with the methodical efficiency of a man who had done this for himself many times. She watched him do it. "Where do you go next?" she asked. She asked it steadily because she had decided, in the time she had been sitting in the dark waiting, that she was not going to pretend not to feel what she felt. "I have an assignment waiting in Indian Territory," he said. "Or I did. I need to send word to Fort Smith that this one is closed." He paused. He set the cloth and the salve tin carefully on the table. He looked at his own hands for a moment, and then he looked up at her. "I could ask for a different assignment, something that does not take me immediately out of Kansas." The candle on the windowsill reached the final depth of its tallow, and the flame began its last minutes. It was very small and very steady, the way small flames sometimes were right at the end. "You could do that," Alberta said. "I am asking," Thomas Walker said, very carefully, as though he was handling something he did not want to break, "whether that would matter to you." Alberta Bailey had been alone for 2 years. She had run a boarding house and managed her accounts and kept the roof over her head and asked nothing from anyone that she could not pay for. She had been entirely self-sufficient, and she had taken a certain pride in this, and she had also been, if she was honest with herself, quietly lonely in the way that people were lonely who had decided that self-sufficiency was the same as not needing anyone. She had decided tonight, while she was sitting in the dark with a candle in the window, that she was done with that particular pretense. "Yes," she said, "it would matter to me." The last thing the candle did before it went out was flare up slightly, a small bright moment, and then it was just darkness and the soft gray light from the window. Thomas Walker did not say anything immediately. He sat very still in the way she had come to recognize as his particular way of processing something that hit him harder than he had quite prepared for. Then he exhaled slowly and said, very quietly, "Alberta." It was the first time he had used her given name. She thought that he could have said very many things to follow her name, and any of them might have been the right thing at that particular moment. What he said was, "I have been a federal marshal for 9 years. I have not stayed anywhere longer than the length of an assignment. I have not had a home. I have not had—" He stopped. He started again. "I have been very alone for a long time, and I have told myself this was what the work required, and I believe I have also told myself, when I was being less honest than I should have been, that it was what I preferred. I am not certain that has been the truth." Outside, the Kansas wind moved and the loose shutter somewhere down the road banged twice and went quiet. "I did not ask you to promise me anything tonight," Alberta said. "No," he agreed, "but I think I want to." She looked at him across the table in the darkness, and she thought that she was not a sentimental woman and never had been, and that this was true even now, and also that sentiment and honesty were not the same thing, and that she could be entirely honest about what she wanted without it being anything other than a clear-eyed assessment of her actual situation. What she wanted was Thomas Walker, not the idea of him. Him specifically, with his particular quietness and his 7 weeks of careful observation and his fixed-roof shingles, and the fact that he had sat in her dark kitchen at 5 in the morning and told her the truth when he could have given her a manageable version. "I think," she said, "that you should send your wire to Fort Smith in the morning, and then we should have this conversation again when you have not just spent the evening being thrown against things by Wade Harkin's associates." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, a real laugh, short and slightly startled, as though the reaction caught him off guard. It did something considerable to his face. "That is entirely fair," he said. He went upstairs to his room and she went to hers, and she lay awake for a while in the dark thinking about the way he had said her name, and the way he had laughed, and the particular quality of the thing that was now openly between them, unnamed but clear, and she thought that she was not sorry about any of it. The morning of November the 4th brought cold sunlight and a hard frost on the porch boards. Alberta was making biscuits when Thomas Walker came downstairs, and he looked better for having slept, the bruise on his jaw darker but the deep tiredness in him somewhat relieved. He sat at the kitchen table while she worked, which was becoming the usual shape of early mornings between them, and he drank his coffee and she made the biscuits and they talked about the weather and the frost, and at some point she said, "I will need to bank the root cellar this week before the hard freezes start," and he said, "I can help with that," and she said, I know you can. Which was a direct echo of things they had said to each other 2 weeks earlier, and she saw him register this, and the corner of his mouth turned up. After breakfast, he walked to the telegraph office, and she did not follow him, and she did not watch for him to come back. She made bread and did her accounts and spoke with the land speculator Mr. Carey about the noise he had been making in the upstairs hall at late hours, which was a violation of her rules, and which she addressed in her customary direct manner. She was in the middle of writing a letter to the supplier in Wichita when she heard him come in. He came to the door of the parlor where she was writing, and he said, "I have requested an assignment in the Kansas district. My superior has 8 days to respond before I am considered available for territorial deployment again." 8 days, she said. 8 days, he agreed. She put down her pen and looked at him properly, not the quick glances she had been allowing herself, but actually looking, and he met her eyes and held them, and there was nothing complicated about what was visible in his expression right now. It was simply and directly what it was, a man who was looking at a woman he wanted very much to stay with. "Then we have 8 days, Alberta said, "to figure out whether we are going to do this." Over the following 8 days, Alberta Bailey and Thomas Walker discovered each other in the way that was available to two careful, private people in a small Kansas cattle town in 1878, which was to say slowly, and with a great deal of conversation, and very little that anyone watching from outside would have categorized as romantic in any demonstrative way. But there were moments. There was the evening they walked along the edge of town, where the creek ran shallow over its winter stones, and she told him about David Bailey, not the David Bailey of public grief which she had long since completed, but the real David Bailey, the man who had believed too hard in things that did not deliver on their promise, and who had loved her in a genuine but insufficient way. And Thomas Walker listened with the full quality of his attention that she had come to value so much, and did not offer comfort or deflection, only what had become between them a rare and reliable honesty. "I am sorry that it was hard," he said. "I am sorry that you were left alone." "I was managing," she said. "I know you were. That is not the same as it not being hard." She thought about this as they walked. The creek made its cold sound over the stones. "What happened to you?" she asked, because she understood that they had reached a place in the 8 days where this question was not overstepping, but its absence would be. Thomas Walker was quiet for long enough that she did not press, which was one of the things he had noticed about her that he kept returning to, the way she asked things and then waited without making the waiting uncomfortable. "I had a family," he said, "before the marshaling. I was married at 22. We had a son." She did not say anything. She waited. "There was a fever outbreak in the county where we lived in Missouri. This would have been 1867. My wife and my son both died of it within a week of each other. My son was 2 years old." Alberta felt the weight of this settle through her with the slow gravity of something that was very old and very heavy. She did not reach for his hand. She said, "That is an enormous amount of loss." "Yes," he said. "I joined the marshal's service about a year after. I think I was looking for a way to spend myself on something that was not myself. Has it worked?" He looked at the creek and then he looked at her. "For a long time I told myself it had." They turned back toward the boarding house, and the lights of Caldwell came into view across the flat ground, and the cold stars were very clear above Kansas. She thought that there were things that could not be fixed, only carried, and that there was a difference between carrying something alone and carrying it while standing next to someone, and that this difference mattered more than she had previously credited. When they reached the porch, she stopped with her hand on the railing, and he stopped beside her, and she said, "I do not want you to leave, Thomas." He put his hand over hers on the railing. It was the first time he had touched her deliberately. His hand was warm in the cold air, and she felt the specific weight of it, the intention of it, and she turned her hand under his so their fingers aligned. "I do not want to leave," he said. They stood on the porch in the cold with their hands holding on the railing, and the candle she had placed in the window the night before had been replaced with a fresh one that she had lit without thinking about it very hard, and neither of them said anything more for a while, because what had just been said was enough. The 8th day brought the response from Fort Smith. Thomas Walker came to her with the telegram in his hand, and his face entirely unreadable in the way it went when he was managing a significant internal event. The response was not an assignment in the Kansas district. It was a recall to Fort Smith for reassignment to Indian Territory, effective in 14 days. Alberta read the telegram. She handed it back to him. She thought about the previous 8 days, about the conversations and the walk by the creek and his hand over hers on the porch railing, and the way she had learned the specific pitch of his voice when he said her name. She said, "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to resign." She had not expected this, not entirely, not so directly and without qualification. "Thomas," she said, because she had to say something, "you have been a federal marshal for 9 years. You cannot resign because of a woman you have known for 3 months." "No," he agreed. "I would not be resigning because of a woman I have known for 3 months." He paused. "I would be resigning because I have been a federal marshal for 9 years, and I am 33 years old, and I am standing in a boarding house kitchen in Caldwell, Kansas, and I am more aware of being alive right now than I have been in the previous 9 years combined. And if that is not sufficient reason to change the direction of one's life, I am not certain what is." Alberta Bailey looked at Thomas Walker and thought that she was a practical woman, and that the practical woman in her had a great number of questions about what this would actually look like, what he would do for a living, and how they would arrange things, and what the people of Caldwell would think, and a dozen other considerations that were entirely real and entirely valid. She asked the practical questions over the next 3 evenings. She asked them in her usual direct way, and he answered them in his equally direct way, and what emerged from these conversations was the following. Thomas Walker had saved nearly every wage he had earned in 9 years of federal service, living simply because there had been nothing he particularly wanted to spend money on. He had enough that, combined with what Alberta had, they could make solid improvements to the boarding house and survive comfortably, while he established himself in Caldwell in whatever capacity the town needed. He had skills beyond law work. He was good with horses, good with land work, good with his hands in the practical sense that her repaired porch and roof shingles attested to. Caldwell was growing. There were things a capable and trustworthy man could do in a growing town. Sheriff Crail, when Thomas Walker visited him on the morning of the 12th day, and laid out his situation with the same direct simplicity with which he laid out everything, said that he had been thinking about taking on a deputy, and that a man with Thomas Walker's record was not the kind of man who came along twice, and that if Thomas Walker wanted to stay in Caldwell in a more permanent official capacity, the position was there. Thomas Walker came home to the boarding house and told Alberta this, and she said, "Deputy," and he said, "Yes," and she said, "That is perhaps not the complete retirement from dangerous work I might have preferred," and he said with the corner of his mouth turning up in the way she had come to love, "Caldwell is quieter than the territory," and she said, "At the moment," and he said, "I believe that is the most agreement I am going to get on this subject," and she laughed. Which was one of the things she had started doing with more frequency since Thomas Walker had taken up residence in her kitchen mornings. On the 14th day, he sent the telegram to Fort Smith with his resignation. On the 15th day, he asked Alberta Bailey to marry him. He did not make a production of it. He came into the kitchen where she was peeling potatoes for supper, and he stood at the end of the table and he said, with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered, "Alberta, I would like to marry you, if you will have me. I am aware that 3 months is a short acquaintance. I am aware that this is a practical arrangement as well as a personal one. I want you to know that I am asking you this because I am in love with you specifically, and that the practical aspects of it, while real and considered, are not the primary reason. Alberta put down the potato and the peeling knife. She looked at him standing at the end of her kitchen table with the November light coming through the window behind him, looking for all the world like a man who was standing on the edge of something high and had decided to step off it anyway. She thought about her years alone. She thought about the boarding house and the careful self-sufficiency and the quiet loneliness she had not fully admitted to even herself until quite recently. She thought about his hand on hers on the porch railing. She thought about him in her kitchen at 5 in the morning in the dark, carrying something too heavy by himself for too long. She said, "I am in love with you too, Thomas." Yes. He crossed the kitchen in about 3 steps and he held her face in his hands very carefully, the way he handled things he did not want to break, and he kissed her, and it was a real kiss, certain and warm and completely without reservation, and when they stepped back from each other they were both somewhat undone by it, which felt exactly right. They were married 3 weeks later in the Caldwell Methodist Church on a cold December morning. The ceremony was brief and earnest, performed by the minister who had served Caldwell since its earliest days as a trail town. Alberta wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had made herself 2 years earlier, and which Thomas Walker, seeing her in it for the first time, said made her eyes look like deep water, which was poetic enough from a man who was not generally given to poetry that she kept the observation in a private part of her memory. Miss Frances Ellison and Mrs. Henrietta Oakes, who had delayed her journey to Denver by a full month and showed no particular urgency about resuming it, were witnesses. Sheriff Arthur Crail attended and shook Thomas Walker's hand afterward with a firmness that communicated his approval. Mr. Percy Hatfield read a poem from the porch of the boarding house when they returned, which was unexpected and rather touching. Alberta Bailey became Alberta Walker on the 3rd of December, 1878, in Caldwell, Kansas, on a morning when the sky was the particular pale gray of high winter and the wind was cold, and the plain stretched flat and wide on all sides of the town. And she felt, standing in the cold on the church steps with Thomas Walker's hand in hers, something that she had not felt for a long time, which was that the ground beneath her was solid and would hold. The winter of 1878 and 1879 was a good one, by the standards of a Kansas winter. They were together in the boarding house through the deep cold months, and this was the season in which they learned each other properly, the daily texture of each other that a short acquaintance could not contain, the particular ways each of them moved through a household and the hours of a day. Thomas Walker joined Sheriff Crail's operation as deputy in January, and proved himself capable and measured, and on the several occasions when his 9 years of federal experience were directly applicable, impressively effective. The town of Caldwell extended him, over the course of that winter and the spring that followed, the particular respect that a small town gave to someone who had demonstrated that he meant to stay and meant to be useful. He was not an easy man to know in the casual sense, but he was a consistent and dependable one, and in a cattle trail town, those qualities were valued. Alberta expanded the boarding house in the spring, adding 2 more rooms on the east side of the property with Thomas's help, and with the money they combined for the purpose, and she found herself adapting to the particular change in the texture of her life that came from doing something alone for years, and then suddenly having someone who was genuinely present and helpful and interested. It was not, she discovered, as difficult an adaptation as she had imagined. She had thought she might find it constraining, after so long alone, to have another person consistently in her space and her decisions. Instead, she found that the right person did not constrain, they expanded. Things that had been effortful alone were lighter shared. Problems that had been hers alone to solve were now considered from 2 angles and usually solved faster. There was also the private life of their marriage, which was not a subject she would have discussed with anyone, but which she thought about sometimes in terms of the plain, unexpected pleasure of it, the warmth, and the particular intimacy of being known at close range by someone who paid the kind of attention Thomas Walker paid to everything. He was a quiet man, but not a distant one, not with her. With her he was present in the complete sense, and she thought sometimes that this was the most significant thing she had ever learned about him, that the same man who wore his reserve in public like a second coat took it off entirely when they were alone together. She did not know how to have articulated, before Thomas Walker, what it was that she had been missing without knowing she was missing it. She knew now. By the following autumn, Alberta discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Thomas Walker on a Sunday morning in October when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone to gold, and the sky was that high clear blue that Kansas did better than anywhere else in September and October. She told him simply and directly, as she told everything, sitting across the kitchen table from him over coffee. He went very still. She watched his face go through several things, the first of which was the quick passage of something that had the specific quality of grief. And she knew this was for the son he had lost, the child who had existed in his life for 2 years and then been taken by a fever in 1867. And she let this move through him without trying to intercept it. Then he looked at her, and what was there now was something entirely different, large and warm and real, and he said, "Alberta," in the way he said her name when he was most himself with her, stripped of the careful management of everything, just completely there. "Are you happy?" she asked, because she wanted to hear it. "I am so happy," he said, and his voice was not quite steady, and she reached across the table and took his hand. Their son was born in June of 1880, a strong-lunged boy they named Samuel David Walker. Samuel for no particular reason, except that it suited him immediately when he appeared, and David as a small private honoring of both the man Alberta had married first and the complexity of the life that had led her where she was. Thomas Walker held his son for the first time with the kind of careful attention he brought to precious things, and said nothing for a long time, and when he finally spoke he said to Alberta, very quietly, "Thank you," which she thought was perhaps the most encompassing thing he could have said. Samuel Walker grew through his first year as babies did, with the astonishing speed of small creatures becoming larger ones, and both his parents discovered within themselves reserves of love and capacity they had not previously measured. Thomas Walker proved to be a father of the particular kind that quiet men sometimes were, fully and completely engaged without requiring an audience for it, endlessly patient, the person Samuel would come for when no one else could manage it, the person who sat on the floor and paid complete attention, and never made his son feel like a second-hand priority. The boarding house continued, and the town continued, and Caldwell grew in the way that cattle trail towns grew in those years, the main street filling in, the church getting a new and larger building, a proper hotel opening at the east end of town that absorbed some of the boarding house traffic but not all, because Alberta Walker had a reputation for good meals and a well-kept house that the hotel could not immediately replicate. In the spring of 1882, while Alberta was visiting Miss Frances Ellison, who had by now been teaching in Caldwell for 4 years and was a genuine friend, she received word that there was trouble at the south end of town. The trouble turned out to be a man named Curtis Pruitt, who had been running a small cattle operation east of town, and who had been involved in some questionable dealings with a group that had connections to the remnants of the Harkin network, which had not entirely disappeared with Harkin's arrest. Curtis Pruitt had come into town with 3 armed men and a grievance about some paperwork involving land rights that he had convinced himself was Thomas Walker's fault, which it was not, because Thomas Walker had simply enforced a legitimate court order, and Pruitt had not liked the enforcement. Alberta heard the word trouble, and she did not panic, because she had been married to a man who did this work for 3.5 years, and she had learned over those years to distinguish between the ordinary difficulties of his work and the genuinely dangerous occasions. She took Samuel to Miss Ellison's house and told her friend to keep him occupied and walked to the sheriff's office herself, because she intended to know what was happening and not to be managed away from the information. Thomas Walker was not in the sheriff's office. He was at the south end of town, she was told, managing the Prout situation. She did not go to the south end of town, because she was not foolish, and understood that her presence there would be a complication rather than a help. She waited at the sheriff's office with a composure that she maintained because it was useful, and that cost her something, sitting on the hard chair by the window and watching the street. After an hour and 15 minutes, Thomas Walker came through the door with Sheriff Crail beside him and Curtis Prout and his associates in custody ahead of them. There was a cut above Thomas Walker's eyebrow that was seeping blood into the crease of his eye, and he was moving with the slight additional care of someone whose ribs had taken a hard knock. He saw Alberta in the chair by the window, and he stopped moving for 1 second in exactly the way he had stopped in her doorway in 1878 when he saw the candle burning on the windowsill. She stood up and crossed the room to him. She did not say anything. She took the clean cloth from her pocket because she had had the forethought to bring one, and she pressed it to the cut above his eyebrow with a firmness that made him wince very slightly. He put his hand over hers and held it there and looked at her. "I am fine," he said. "I can see that," she said. "I am also aware that if you were not fine I would be the last to hear about it and you would claim to be fine regardless, so I am working with incomplete information. The ribs are bruised," he said, "not broken. You cannot know that without a physician. I am fairly confident." "Fairly," she said. "I have broken ribs before. These do not have that quality." She held his gaze and she felt the particular texture of her feeling for him, which was not simply love in the soft sense but something more complex and more complete, something that held irritation and gratitude and profound relief all at once, and she thought that this was probably what loving a person for long enough actually felt like, not the singular emotion of early attachment but this larger and more intricate thing. "Samuel is with Francis," she said. "Come home." He came home. The physician was sent for and confirmed bruised ribs and applied proper attention to the cut above the eyebrow and told Thomas Walker to rest for a week, which Thomas Walker agreed to, and then rested for 4 days before Sheriff Crail came to say he was needed. And Alberta said nothing about this beyond one expressive look that Thomas Walker received with the slight sheepishness of a man who knows he is caught. Curtis Prout was convicted of assault and disturbing the peace, and his land dealings were investigated and found to be fraudulent, and he served time accordingly. The remnants of the Harkin network, which had been gradually dismantled over the previous 3 years by the Marshal Service, were effectively finished by this series of prosecutions. The South Corridor of Caldwell became, over the following year, considerably quieter. In the autumn of 1882, Mrs. Henrietta Oakes, who had finally made it to Denver and settled there with her daughter, and written Alberta long and increasingly cheerful letters for the past 4 years, wrote to say she was remarried to a kind man who kept a hardware store and was very happy. Alberta read this letter to Thomas Walker after supper, and he said, "Good," with a simple sincerity that she appreciated, because he had met Mrs. Oakes only briefly but had always been warmly courteous to her. In January of 1883, Alberta told Thomas Walker she was expecting their second child. This time there was no momentary shadow of the old grief in his face before the happiness. The happiness came directly, uncomplicated and large, and he pulled her close and held her in the kitchen in the cold January morning, and she rested her head against his shoulder and thought that this was one of the very good moments of her life, this specific one, and that she would keep it. Their second son was born in September of 1883. They named him James Arthur Walker, Arthur for Sheriff Crail, who was genuinely moved by this, and who became one of those honorary uncles that children adored, and James because Thomas Walker had a brother named James who had died young, and whom he had rarely spoken of but whose name Alberta had heard in a rare unguarded moment, and filed away carefully, understanding without being told that it was a name that carried weight. Samuel Walker, 3.5 years old by then, took the arrival of his brother with the mixed feelings of firstborn children everywhere: first suspicion, then enormous proprietary pride, then the kind of devoted attachment that older siblings sometimes developed that became one of the foundations of both their characters. By the time James could walk, he was following Samuel everywhere, and Samuel was simultaneously trying to prevent him from doing anything dangerous and doing half the dangerous things himself. Alberta and Thomas Walker observed this dynamic with the fond exhaustion of parents and largely let it run, intervening only when the danger reached genuinely unacceptable levels. The boarding house was by this time a well-established institution of Caldwell, one of the things the town pointed to with local pride in the way of towns that were building an identity. Alberta had hired 2 women to help with the cooking and the laundry, which gave her more time for the management aspects she found most interesting and more time for the hours that mattered most to her, the early mornings with Thomas, the evenings when the boys were in bed and the house was quiet and she and her husband sat in the front room or on the porch and talked or read or simply existed in the same space in the comfortable way of people who had learned each other thoroughly and were not tired of what they had found. It was on one of these quiet evenings in the spring of 1884, when Samuel was almost 4 and James was 6 months old and sleeping upstairs, that Thomas Walker said something that Alberta had been, without quite knowing it, waiting for him to say. They were on the porch. The Kansas evening was warm for April, the first real warmth after the long winter, and the main street of Caldwell had the quality of a town that was exhaling after a cold season. Thomas Walker was in his chair and Alberta was on the porch step with her feet on the lower step and her tea gone cold in her hands, and he said, out of the comfortable quiet, "I was thinking about the house." "What about it?" she said. "I want to build on another section, not for the boarding house, for us, for the boys, something that is more room than we have now." Alberta looked at the front of the boarding house, which she had been looking at for 8 years now, first as a widow running a business and then as a woman with a husband and sons and a life that had expanded well beyond what she had imagined when she first opened it. "The east side," she said. "There is room on the east side." "That is where I was thinking," he agreed. "You would need more lumber than you can get locally. You would need to order from Wichita. I wrote to the supplier last week to get figures." She turned and looked at him on the porch. He met her eyes and the corner of his mouth was turned up in the way that she loved, the way that was particularly his, wry and warm at once. "You already wrote to the supplier," she said. "I wanted to know if it was feasible before bringing it up. Thomas Walker, you have been married to me for 6 years and you still think you need to prepare your argument before presenting it to me." "I do not prepare arguments," he said. "I prepare information. There is a distinction." She laughed and he laughed, and in the house above them James stirred in his sleep and made a small sound and then settled. And the evening was warm and smelled of spring grass, and the main street of Caldwell went about its business at the comfortable pace of an April evening in 1884. They built the addition that summer with Thomas Walker doing the majority of the framing himself and hiring 2 local carpenters for the skilled work. And by September, they had 4 additional rooms that were entirely the Walker family's own, separate from the boarding house operations, with a larger kitchen and a proper sitting room and a bedroom for each boy as they grew into needing them. Alberta went through the process of establishing the new space with the same organized attention she brought to everything, and also with a private pleasure that she did not entirely explain even to Thomas, which was the pleasure of having something that was simply a home, not a business and a home tangled together, but a distinct and deliberate home that they had made. On the evening that the last piece of furniture was arranged in the new sitting room and the first fire was lit in the new stone fireplace, Thomas Walker put a candle in the new window. Alberta looked at it. She looked at him. "I believe," he said, "that is your tradition." "It was not a tradition," she said. "It was a single act on a specific evening in 1878 when I was not sleeping anyway, and you were out doing something inadvisable, and someone had to make sure the light was on. It was a tradition," he said. "I am making it official." She shook her head, but she did not take the candle out of the window. She sat down on the new sofa, and Thomas Walker sat beside her, and she leaned against him, and the fire made its warm sound in the new fireplace, and the candle burned steadily in the window, and upstairs their sons slept in their rooms in the house they had built. She thought about the candle she had put in the window that night in November of 1878, and about the way he had come through the door and stopped and said what he said, and about the silence that had followed and what it had held, all the things that had been between them that neither of them had named yet, all the things that had been about to begin. "Do you know," she said, "I almost put the candle out. Before I came in." He looked down at her. "I had my hand over it twice, thinking I ought to just go to bed like a sensible woman and not sit up in the dark for a man who had not asked me to." "I am glad you did not," he said. "So am I," she said. "Though I would not have apologized for it even if you had not come." He smiled. "I know," he said. "I know you would not have." She put her hand on his, and they sat in front of the fire in the new room in the home they had built together in the middle of the Kansas plain, and the candle in the window burned on. The years that followed in Caldwell were full ones. Samuel Walker grew into a serious and capable boy with his father's watchfulness and his mother's precision. And James Walker grew into a person of considerable charm and enormous affection for everyone he encountered, which delighted Alberta and reminded Thomas Walker of the particular variety of chaos that warm-hearted people introduced into orderly households. They quarreled, as brothers did, with passion and specificity, and reconciled in the sweeping, unconditional way of children who had never learned to hold grudges, and were, in the fundamental way that mattered, devoted to each other and to their parents. Sheriff Crail retired in the spring of 1886, and with some considerable pressure from both Crail himself and the town council, Thomas Walker took on the role of sheriff of Caldwell. He accepted this with the same measured commitment he brought to everything, and if he felt the significance of it, of being somewhere, of being the sheriff of a specific place that was his own, rather than a man deployed to wherever the next assignment required, he did not make a speech about it. He just did the work, carefully and consistently, and the town of Caldwell was the better for it. Alberta took on a partner in the boarding house in 1887, a capable young woman named Ruth Carey, who was no relation to the land speculator from years back, but who had come to Caldwell with her own intentions and her own savings, and who had the particular mix of warmth and firmness that the work required. This freed Alberta for more of the management she enjoyed and gave her, for the first time in 9 years, genuine regular time that was not consumed by the immediate demands of the house. She used some of this time to teach herself bookkeeping properly, using texts she ordered from the publisher Incent. Louis and she became, over the following years, someone that several of the other business owners in Caldwell came to for help with their accounts, which she provided on a fair fee basis, and which she found she genuinely enjoyed, the clean logic of it, the way it made order from the complicated facts of a working enterprise. In the spring of 1888, with Samuel 8 years old and James 4.5, Alberta told Thomas Walker she believed she was expecting again. He was 53 then. No, he was 38. She caught the quick mental arithmetic he did and the brief look that was not uncertainty but a kind of wondering, and she waited. "Are you well?" He asked first because he was the kind of man who asked this first. "I am very well," she said. "I am a little tired and I am very well." He exhaled slowly. "This is good news," he said. "This is very good news." He said it as though he was checking the truth of it against his own internal account and finding that it was true. "I thought you might think so," she said, with the dry gentleness that was one of the textures of how she loved him. Their third child was born in November of 1888 and was a daughter, the first girl, whom they named Eleanor after no one in particular, except that the name suited her immediately and completely. Eleanor Walker arrived in the world with a decided quality that her parents recognized very early as belonging specifically to her, a focused interest in everything, an early and persistent verbality, a complete lack of concern about the opinions of people who did not matter to her. Samuel, 8 years old, took one look at his baby sister and became her devoted guardian. James, who had been enjoying his status as youngest for 4.5 years, had a brief period of adjustment and then decided that a sister was interesting and adopted her entirely. By the time Alina Walker was 2 years old, she had 2 older brothers who would have done nearly anything she asked, and 2 parents who were equally and somewhat helplessly in love with the specific personality she was developing. Alberta found, watching this third child, that she understood something about the nature of love that she had not quite articulated before, that it did not divide when it expanded but multiplied, that the love she had for Samuel and for James and for Thomas was not reduced by Alina's arrival, but added to in a way that did not seem to have an upper bound, and she thought that this was perhaps the most remarkable thing about being alive, this expandability of attachment. Thomas Walker, sheriff of Caldwell, husband and father at 38, was a man she looked at sometimes in the ordinary middle of their ordinary days and thought she knew as well as she had ever known anyone, and that there was still more to know, and that this was what she would choose again if she were given the choice again, this specific man in this specific life, without hesitation. They had a photograph made in the summer of 1889. All 5 of them in front of the house on a Saturday morning, Thomas in his good coat and Alberta in the blue wool dress that still fit and still made Thomas Walker say things about deep water when she wore it. Samuel very upright and serious in a smaller version of his father's general posture. James beaming with the complete physical commitment he gave to all expressions of feeling. Alina Walker, not yet a year old, looking directly at the camera with an expression of extreme assessment. Alberta kept the photograph on the mantel in the sitting room where the first fire had burned, and where Thomas continued, in all the years after, to put a candle in the window on evenings when he was home late, not because he needed a light to find his way, but because he knew she knew what it meant, and because some things became, over the years, the private language of 2 people who had found each other. She never apologized for it. She never would. The candle meant the same thing it had always meant, from the very first night she had put it in the window in the cold November of 1878. It meant that she was there. It meant that she was waiting, not out of worry or obligation, not because he had asked her to, but because she chose to, because she wanted to be the person with the light on when he came home. He had told her once, 2 years into their marriage, that the first night he saw it he had stood in the doorway for a full 20 seconds before he could say anything, because he had not expected it, and because the sight of it, the small deliberate candle in the window of the house he had come back to, had moved him in a way he had not been prepared for. She had told him she had been within moments of putting it out before he arrived. He had said that either way it had been burning when he came in, and that was what he knew. She thought about that sometimes, that either way it had been burning when he came in. That it did not matter that she had debated it, that she had held her hand over the flame twice in the preceding hour and thought about being a sensible woman who went to bed. What mattered was that she had kept it burning and he had come home, and neither of them had let that moment pass without stepping into it. There were things in a life, she had come to understand, that could not be prepared for or reasoned into. They could only be met. You met them by being present and by being honest, and by not apologizing for the small fires you kept burning in the windows of your life for the people you loved. By the winter of 1890, Caldwell was a different town than it had been in 1878, and not entirely the same kind of trouble rode through it anymore. The cattle trail era was shifting, the railroads extending further and changing the routes and the nature of the commerce that had built these trail towns. Caldwell was adapting, as towns did, discovering what it would be next. Alberta Walker was adapting with it, and in some ways ahead of it, her bookkeeping work and her partnership with Ruth Carey, and her sharp attention to the economics of the region, giving her a perspective that made her, without her having sought it, one of the people whose judgment the town consulted when it was making decisions. Thomas Walker was, and remained, the kind of law that Caldwell needed, clear and fair, and without the corruption that had compromised some other trail town law operations over the same period. He was known as a straight man, in the precise historical meaning, a man whose word was reliable and whose principles were not for sale. And this reputation was the thing he was most honestly proud of, more than any specific event or achievement. They had, in the winter of 1890, a conversation that they had been circling toward for some time, about whether to stay in Caldwell or to consider something different. The nature of the town was changing, and they were both approaching 40, and the boys were getting old enough to have opinions about the shape of their own futures. And there were possibilities to the west and south that a man with Thomas Walker's skills and a woman with Alberta Walker's capabilities might have built something different from, if they had wanted to. They talked about it over several evenings. In the thorough way they talked about things that mattered, from all sides, and with honest accounting of what they each wanted and what they could reasonably expect. What they found at the end of these conversations was that they were in the right place. This was not a failure of imagination. They had imagined the alternatives. They had considered them seriously and with the kind of clear-eyed attention that was their collective mode. What they found was that Caldwell was their town. Their names were in the ground here, not literally yet, but in the way that years of work and investment and community left a person's name in a place. Their children had been born here. Their first conversation had happened in this kitchen. Their first deliberately held hands on this porch railing. They were known here, fully and truly known, not as abstractions or newcomers, but as Alberta and Thomas Walker, who had built something real in this specific place on the Kansas plain. Samuel Walker, at 10 years old, announced his intention to read the law and become an attorney, which his father received with the sober pride of a man who had spent his professional life in the legal system and understood what it required and what it offered. His mother received it with her characteristic practicality and immediately began assessing what preparations would be needed. James Walker, at 7, announced his intention to be something different every week, which was consistent with his general personality and which his parents found more endearing than alarming, understanding that he would arrive somewhere interesting by his own route. Eleanor Walker, at 2, announced her intentions primarily in the form of extremely direct eye contact and an increasingly sophisticated vocabulary, and both her parents had begun to suspect that she was going to be a force of considerable consequence in whatever field she eventually chose. These were ordinary days and also extraordinary ones, in the way that the days of a life that is well lived were ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, each one unremarkable from the outside and deeply full from the inside. On a November evening in 1891, exactly 13 years after the first night, Alberta had put a candle in the window. Thomas Walker came home late from a matter out on the eastern road and came through the front door to find the candle burning in the window, and Alberta in her chair with her book open on her lap and her reading glasses, which were new and which she wore with a resigned practicality that he found quietly charming, perched on her nose. She looked up at him over the glasses. He hung his hat. He came and sat in the chair across from her. He looked at the candle in the window, burning with the same steady quality it always had, and then he looked at her. "You are still doing that," he said. "I have always done that," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you have." He leaned forward and he took her book gently out of her hands and set it on the table with the spine up, so she would not lose her page, and then he took both her hands in his and held them in the way that was entirely his, with that specific quality of careful and complete attention that had been his from the beginning. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Thomas," she said, with the slight dryness that meant she was paying the fullest attention and wanted him to continue. "I have thought a great deal," he said, "about what my life would look like if you had put that candle out." She looked at him. "The night I came home and found it burning," he said. "When I said what I said, you told me later you had almost put it out. I want you to know that I know what it cost you to leave it burning. I know that you are not a person who waits for anyone without having decided to, and I know that deciding to was not a small thing." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "it was not a small thing." "I know," he said. "I am grateful for it every day." Outside, the Kansas night was cold and clear and full of stars. Inside, the candle burned in the window as it always had, as it would continue to do on all the evenings when Thomas Walker came home late, and Alberta Walker kept the light on. She had never apologized for it. She would not start now. She squeezed his hands and he squeezed back, and the candle held its light against the dark, warm and steady and deliberate, exactly as she had intended it to be. Their life continued in Caldwell, in the house they had built, in the town that carried their history in its streets and its commerce and its social fabric. Samuel Walker studied the law. James Walker eventually discovered that what he wanted was to work the land, which surprised everyone including himself until it didn't. And he took to the agricultural reality of the Kansas plains with an enthusiasm and aptitude that confirmed there was always something to be said for following the unexpected direction. Eleanor Walker, who had been assessing everything and everyone since the moment of her birth, grew into herself with a formidable intelligence and a warmth that was all her own, and that even at 6 and 7 years old was already shaping the world immediately around her in ways that were impossible to ignore. Thomas Walker kept his post as sheriff until he passed the office to a qualified younger man in 1895, having served the town of Caldwell for 9 years as its law and having, in that time, built a record that the town's future legal history would reference. He moved then into something he had not anticipated wanting, which was the work of the land itself, buying a modest property on the north edge of town, and turning his attention to it with the same methodical persistence he had applied to every other work of his life. He was not a farmer by training, but he was a man who could learn what he needed to learn and was not too proud to learn it. And he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the work of growing things was profoundly satisfying in a way that law work, for all its importance, had never quite been. Alberta continued her partnership in the boarding house and expanded her bookkeeping work until it was a proper practice with 2 employees and a reputation throughout the region. She had become, without any particular intention toward it, a businesswoman of genuine capability, in a time when such a thing was both more unusual and more necessary for women on the frontier than the histories would always acknowledge. She ran her practice the same way she had always run everything, with complete attention and no tolerance for nonsense. And she was respected in Caldwell with the particular respect that was paid to someone who had been essential for long enough that the essential was taken for granted, which is the highest compliment a community ever pays. On the evening of December the 3rd, 1896, which was their 18th wedding anniversary, Thomas Walker took Alberta to supper at the best restaurant Caldwell had by then, which was a considerable improvement on the trail town options of 1878. Samuel, 16, stayed home with James, who was 13, and Eleanor, who was 7, and managed the evening with an authority over his siblings that he was either naturally suited for or had inherited from his mother, possibly both. Thomas Walker and Alberta Walker sat across from each other at a table with a proper cloth on it, and proper candles in the center, and Alberta looked at her husband in the candlelight, at the gray that was coming into his dark hair now, and the lines of the years around his eyes that she found she loved more than she had loved the face without them, because the lines were all specific, and she knew each story behind them. She thought about the man who had come to her door with an exhausted horse and 3 months of secrets, and the particular quality of careful watchfulness that had been. She now understood, partly professional training and partly the deep wariness of a man who had lost everything once and had since been very careful not to have anything to lose again, until a boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas had quietly and thoroughly rearranged that calculation. "What are you thinking?" Thomas Walker asked, because after 18 years he could see when she was somewhere specific in her thoughts and was interested in where. "I am thinking about the first day you came to my door," she said. "September the 4th, 1878, he said without needing to consider it. "You looked," she said, "like a man who had been traveling for a very long time." "I had been," he said, "in more than the literal sense." "I thought you were trouble," she said. "I was not wrong to think it," he said, which made her laugh. She reached across the table and he took her hand and held it on the white cloth between the candles, and the restaurant around them had its particular life of other people's conversations, and the sound of silver on china, and outside, the Kansas night was cold and December dark, and neither of them was anywhere else at all. "I want to tell you something," Alberta said, echoing without planning to the way he had said it 5 years earlier by the candle in the sitting-room window. He waited, with his particular patience that was not just patience but full attention. "When I put that candle in the window," she said, "I was not thinking about what I hoped you would say when you came in. I was not thinking about any of this." She indicated with a small gesture the everything of their life. "I was thinking only that it was very dark outside and you had been out a long time, and I was not able to be anywhere else but in that chair." "I know," he said softly. "What I want to tell you," she said, "is that I have never once in 18 years wished I had put it out." Thomas Walker looked at his wife across the candle-lit table in the restaurant in Caldwell, Kansas, on the 18th anniversary of their marriage, and he thought about the road that had brought him to a boarding house door in September of 1878. The years before that were empty in the specific way of years, lived without purpose beyond survival, the long and quiet damage of being entirely alone. And he thought about the night he had come through her door, and found the candle burning, and understood in one immediate and irreversible moment that someone had been waiting for him. He thought that a person could spend a very long time not knowing what they were missing and then encounter it in a single moment and understand completely, not gradually but entirely, what had been absent and what was now present. He had understood it that night. He understood it now. "Neither have I," he said. "Neither have I." The candle between them burned steadily, as candles did when there was no wind to disturb them, warm and clear and entirely, deliberately lit. Outside, Caldwell went about its evening. The main street held its lights. The stars above the Kansas plain were the same stars that had been above it in 1878 and would be above it long after, indifferent to the particulars of any one story happening in any one small town underneath them. But stories were not nothing because the universe was vast. Stories were. Alberta Walker had come to think over the course of a life that had been considerably larger than she had planned for, the specific and irreplaceable way that people made meaning out of the enormous, indifferent fact of being alive. Their story was this: a woman alone in a house she was building into something, a man who had been traveling too long toward nothing, a candle in a window in the dark of a November night, and everything that had followed from the fact that when he came in she had not apologized for keeping it lit. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every way that mattered, everything. The years continued, and the children grew, and the town grew, and the lives of all of them had their particular shapes, the ordinary and the extraordinary woven together in the way that the actual texture of living was always woven. Samuel Walker read the law and became an attorney in Wichita, and married a woman named Clara who had Thomas Walker's same quality of attentive quietness, and who Alberta took to immediately. James Walker worked the land outside Caldwell and married a girl from the neighboring county, named Lily, who was energetic and funny, and who James had met at a county fair in 1899 and been entirely certain about within a week, which his mother attributed to having learned certainty honestly from his parents. Eleanor Walker, who Alberta had suspected from infancy of being a force of consequence, grew up and became a school teacher, and then a principal, and then, by 1910, a woman of considerable influence in Kansas education whose clear intelligence and absolute refusal to accept lesser options for the children in her care were exactly as formidable as the 2-year-old's direct stare had always promised they would be. Thomas Walker and Alberta Walker grew older together in the house they had built, and in the town they had helped build, and in the presence of the children and grandchildren, who were the ongoing evidence of the life they had made from a candle in a window and the courage not to apologize for it. On an evening in the spring, when the Kansas sky was that impossible blue and the cottonwoods were in early leaf, and the plain around Caldwell had the quality of everything new that a genuine spring carried, Alberta sat on the porch in the evening light, and Thomas Walker came out and sat beside her, as he had done on more evenings than either of them could count. They watched the light change over the plain. "I love this town," Alberta said. "Yes," said Thomas Walker, "I love this house." "Yes." She looked at him, at the full and specific truth of him beside her, the man she knew better than she had known anything in her life and who she was still, after all these years, finding new things to know. "I love you," she said. He turned and looked at her with the same full attention he had always given her, the same clear gray eyes that had never once in all their years together looked at her with anything other than the complete honesty of someone who had decided to be seen. "I love you, Alberta," he said. The evening settled around them, warm and unhurried. Somewhere in the house a grandchild was making noise in the specific way of small children who were supposed to be in bed. Somewhere down the road, the town continued its ongoing business, ordinary and full, the same way it had always been. The candle that Alberta would light later in the window, as she had lit it on more evenings than she could count, was not yet burning, but it would be. It always was. It always would be.